Change in tone and the change in the rhetoric today. White House Press Secretary Robert Gibbs was about as forceful as we've seen him yet from the podium, saying what the Egyptian government has done is not enough. In the past, he said that comments about Egypt not being ready for democracy were not helpful. But we have seen in just the last 2 days, we heard the Vice President, Joe Biden, reached out to the Vice President in Egypt, Omar Suleiman, and he made some demands. He said that the Constitution needs to be changed. Journalists, human rights workers, those need to stop being arrested, detained, and beaten. And they need to broaden who the opposition is talking to. And you saw the government of Egypt, the current government, really rebuke that. So you can see that the question has gone from should President Mubarak stay in power. We've seen the administration really trying to not answer that. And when they've hinted at it, they've sort of changed the tone back and forth. But now it seems that they are directly engaging with the Egyptian government and especially the vice president in a heated back and forth.
Is there any sense that the threat of this package that the U.S. offers Egypt every year, more than $1 billion, is the U.S. thinking of putting any conditions on that?
You know, it's been interesting to watch this threat of the money. It's $1.3 billion in aid for the military. It's $200 million for economic programs. And since the protests broke out in Egypt, we've seen different administration officials take different tones when it comes to the aid package. First, it was the White House Press Secretary Robert Gibbs who said, we are reviewing the aid package. Then just a few days later, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said, we're not talking about aid at all. Well, now we're hearing again that they are looking at the aid package, but they're putting some strings on it. They're saying they're going to look at it depending on what the government of Egypt does. Specifically, they're talking about violence against the protesters. That is their big concern. They want to make sure that the protesters are not harmed in any way. But at the same time, when you talk to White House officials behind the scenes, they'll tell you it's only $1.3 billion, which of course to you and I seems like a lot of money. But the White House is really downplaying that gets them much influence when it comes to officials in Egypt. Yeah. And I do want to point out that they are having an important meeting that we're going to be watching at the White House today. Ehud Barak, the Israeli Defense Force Minister, he's going to be at the White House. I believe he's there right now. He's meeting with Secretary Clinton, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, and the President's National Security Advisor, Tom Donilon. We don't know if President Obama is going to drop by that meeting, but that usually does happen. So we're expecting a readout after that meeting is concluded.
Yeah, definitely. Israel, not only the U.S., but Israel have a lot riding on the situation in Egypt. Patty, thank you. Saudi Arabia's oil reserves aren't as big as people think. Well, that's according to the latest U.S. diplomatic cables from WikiLeaks. American officials are apparently very concerned about how much the country actually has and how that will impact on the price of a barrel of oil. Imran Khan has more.
Selling the dream, from ancient desert to modern refinery, the image the Saudis want you to see is clear. A world leader in oil production, the world's largest oil exporter, and a key player in controlling what we pay at the petrol pump. But cracks are beginning to emerge in this carefully controlled image. According to leaked diplomatic cables from the US Embassy in Riyadh, one senior oil executive has cast serious doubt over Saudi Arabia's oil capacity. To encourage investment and confidence, you need a credible system of telling the world exactly how much oil you can access. Officially, Saudi Arabia says it has 716 billion barrels of oil in reserve. Not so, says Sadat al-Husseini, a former senior oil executive quoted in the US diplomatic cables. He says they're overselling oil reserves by as much as 40%. That's a massive drop. The US is clearly worried. Saudi is one of its biggest oil providers. If proved true, its impact on oil prices could be profound. The more you pump and get on the market, the cheaper oil becomes. For investors, knowing exactly how much Saudi oil there is crucial. Reserves then become critical in predicting oil prices. Saudi Arabia finds itself with a problem. More and more oil experts are beginning to question Saudi reserves. That could have an impact globally. Any downgrading of Saudi reserves would send oil prices up. That's a nightmare scenario for a world dependent on oil. Imran Khan, Al Jazeera.
Hundreds of opposition supporters have taken to the streets of Sri Lanka to protest against rising food prices. Organized by the United National Party, the demonstration also called for the release of the former Army General Sarath Fonseca. He was detained a year ago and was later jailed for corruption. Thailand and Cambodia will present their arguments over a border dispute at the United Nations next week. Both countries blame each other for damage to an ancient Hindu temple that's located at the center of recent military clashes. At least 11 people have died in the fighting and thousands have fled their homes.
Last night, the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon rang me and he said, "These are armed clashes." I said, "No, this is war." So Cambodia is asking the UN Security Council to call an immediate meeting on that.
Defense talks between North and South Korean military officials have ended abruptly. Representatives from North Korea walked out on the discussions when the two sides couldn't agree on what should be their agenda for future talks. Relations between the two nations have been strained since the North shelled a South Korean island in November, killing 4 people. Cuban Americans are assessing the potential impact of a new White House policy in relation to their homeland. The Obama administration has eased travel restrictions and increased the amount of money that Americans can send to their relatives in Cuba. Kimberly Halkett reports.
Okay, it's coming up.
For Domingo Amorsastegui, preparing Cuban coffee is a daily ritual. But he says it's bittersweet, much like his memories of living in Cuba under the United States economic embargo. The U.S. put commercial limits on Cuba when Domingo was just a young man to push it towards democracy. After 50 years of waiting, Domingo says President Obama's recent relaxing of some restrictions is just a rehashing of a Clinton White House policy.
Expectations were higher. And the fact that they are not coming up with fresh ideas, fresh initiatives, something that will go beyond what we have already experienced one way or another.
Admittedly, this easing of restrictions is not a dramatic shift in White House policy towards Cuba. So you can understand why older generation Cuban Americans, like the ones gathered here in Little Havana in Florida, say they're somewhat skeptical. They say they've seen it all before. But when it comes to the younger generation, they're more optimistic.
Felice Gorordo heads up a Cuban student movement called Roots of Hope. He says the communist government has just issued 75,000 self-employment licenses to offset massive state layoffs and encourage entrepreneurs.
It's significant because for the first time there is some sort of a movement and some sort of change going on the island. And it's important for us to reach out to our counterparts now more than ever before.
Gorordo wants to inspire young Cubans to think beyond the U.S. embargo and provide tools for Cuban workers to succeed. His latest project, collecting used cell phones, a luxury few can afford.
And this is significant for Cuba because up until 2008, cell phones were illegal.
But many of the older Cubans are tired of what they call political game playing with their beloved island nation. What they want isn't a reworking of an old U.S. policy, but instead an entirely new one for Cuba teetering on the fringes of change. Kimberly Halkett, Al Jazeera, Miami.
This is Al Jazeera. These are the stories making headlines. Pro-democracy protests have continued in Egypt, and demonstrations have been held outside the parliament. Mass strikes have also been taking place. All this comes as negotiators meet to discuss the future transition of power. Jordan's King Abdullah has sworn in a new government. The reshuffle was prompted by protests calling for a change in the country. They were inspired by the demonstrations in Egypt and Tunisia. Ex-Army Chief General Maruf Baghit becomes Prime Minister. He's been tasked with implementing new legislation. Italian prosecutors are demanding Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi go on trial immediately. The call follows allegations he paid for sex with a 17-year-old Moroccan dancer and then used his political power to cover it up. U.S. aid to Pakistan is under threat over the detention of an American citizen who shot and killed 2 armed men. Relations between Islamabad and Washington have been strained since the incident took place in Lahore 2 weeks ago. The U.S. State Department has again insisted that Raymond Davis has diplomatic immunity. Former Liberian President Charles Taylor has boycotted his war crimes trial at The Hague for the second day running. The proceedings have now been adjourned while the judges decide whether to allow an appeal by Taylor's legal team. His lawyers are angry that a defense document has been ruled inadmissible. Taylor denies 11 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity during the Sierra Leone civil war in the 1990s. Security is tight in Indonesia ahead of the latest trial of the Muslim cleric Abu Bakr Bashir. 1,200 police have been deployed near the courthouse in South Jakarta. Bashir's supporters are expected to hold a rally outside. It's the cleric's third trial on terrorism-related charges in a decade. Hundreds of opposition supporters have taken to the streets of Sri Lanka to protest against the rising food prices. Organized by the United National Party, the demonstration also called for the release of the former army general, Sarat Fonseca. He was detained a year ago and was later jailed for corruption. Talks between the North and South Korean military have broken down. Neither side could agree on the agenda for future discussions. Tensions have been high on the peninsula since the North shelled a South Korean island that was back in November, killing 4 people. The news continues here at the top of the hour. For now, it's people and power.
This is People in Power, and I'm Summer El-Shahat. On today's program, Egypt's Seeds of Change.
يوم أتوقع أنه أكبر بكتير من يوم ال 25 لأن الحشد كبير جدا على الإنترنت وعلى الرسائل وحتى الناس في الشارع بتتكلم بصورة كبيرة.
It's widely accepted that the spark for the recent dramatic events in Egypt came from last month's uprising in Tunisia. If people power could bring down one despotic regime, so the thinking went, then perhaps it could do the same elsewhere. Many of the necessary conditions were already in place. Public fury at years of political repression, an economy that rewarded a corrupt elite and kept a majority in poverty, and widespread loathing for a leader clinging to office. But could Egyptians be persuaded to overcome 30 years of fear and apathy and take to the streets? Well, it's no accident that that question was answered emphatically. Over the first remarkable 10 days of the protest, people in power